Good morning and welcome to the webinar on budgeting for the future of fuel tax and road charges. My name is Michelle and I'll be your webinar moderator today. Today's webinar is presented by Ramon Staheli, Head of Economics at the National Transport Commission. Ramon has a wealth of experience in pricing, market design and regulatory economics, having worked as a consultant in the electricity industry and the public sector. He has held senior positions as a market regulator advisor and pricing and planning manager for a large New Zealand electricity generator and retailer, providing him with extensive knowledge in strategic market design and operation advice to electricity market governance bodies in Singapore and New Zealand. Like always, we'd love to hear from you during today's presentation. If you have a question, please feel free to type in your question in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll be answering the questions at the end of the session. So welcome, Ramon, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Michelle, and good morning to everybody, and thanks very much for taking the time to listen to my quick presentation. I'll just go through some slides first, but at the end, obviously, there'll be plenty of time to discuss what you've heard. If you've got any clarifications needed throughout the presentation, please let me know. So what I want to do today is give a bit of a background as to where we're at with heavy vehicle charges and where Minister's consideration of that issue is. So I'll give it a bit of a background, then look at the options that Ministers have asked us to consult on and the process from here. So just a bit of recap to start off with. The PAYGO model, which has been used to set heavy vehicle charges for a long time, effectively works as illustrated by the following slide. So the first step is that we collect road expenditure data from states and territories every year. And we use a model to split these costs, to allocate these costs depending on expenditure category between heavy vehicles and light vehicles. And we effectively disregard all the light vehicle costs, and then the aim is to recover the heavy vehicle cost base, that is the amount on that yellow square there, through a combination of road user charges on diesel fuel and gaseous fuels and roads component of registration charges. Alongside that, we have the regulatory component of registration charges, which is set to recover the NHVR's budget, which is approved by ministers. So, as you well know, the road user charge is collected by the Commonwealth. The roads component of registration charges collected by the states and territories where the vehicle is registered. And the regulatory component is also collected by the registration authorities in each state and territory, but passed straight on to the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator. So what's been going on in this model in recent times? One of the things I just want to touch on briefly is show how much government expenditure has changed over time. And you can look at the table here. You can see on the left the expenditure categories. Then the next column shows what percentage of those costs are allocated to heavy vehicles. Then we look at what was expenditure in 2020-21, then how much did it change to in 21-22, and 21-22 is the last actual number that we've got. So what you can see is some of these numbers that I've highlighted have gone up quite massively. So the ones in sort of peach color highlighted have gone up by significant amounts and percentages. And you can see of these, a large percentage is allocated to heavy vehicles, and it's related to the need to rehabilitate and improve pavements to cope with the weights imposed by heavy vehicles. And on the contrary, you can see some of the expenditure has gone down. But of course, if you look at the percentage that's allocated to heavy vehicles here, it's quite low. So the picture is really one that overall expenditure's gone up significantly. So if you look at the bottom line, there's over 1.7 billion increase over 1 year, but it's also gone up in categories where a large percentage is allocated to heavy vehicles, and that's driven a fairly steep increase in the heavy vehicle cost base. So this graph here shows a little bit of the history of the heavy vehicle cost base and heavy vehicle charges revenue. So if you look at, start at the left, look at the blue line, what that shows us is what revenue from heavy vehicle charges has been over time, and that includes both registration charges and the road user charge. The red line is the heavy vehicle cost base, and if you look at the last point here on the right in 21-22, you can see the big increase that was driven effectively by the changes in the table that I showed before. On the right-hand side of the graph, you can see at the top, a maroon or dark red line, and that's a forecast we tried to develop together with states and territories of what this cost base is likely to do over the next 2 years. And while there's a degree of uncertainty around exactly where that will sit in practice, I think what's fairly safe to say is it's unlikely to go down or go down at all or decline rapidly. And then on the right-hand side, you see an olive line, which effectively shows what revenue would do if heavy vehicle charges were increased by 6% per annum over 3 years from 23-24 onwards. And the dark green line there shows what would happen if heavy vehicle charges were increased by 10% per annum. And what you can see is that even under the 10% option, you wouldn't even reach the level of the current cost base by the end of 3 years. So none of those options that we've consulted on would in themselves be sufficient to achieve full cost recovery, which is one of the principles underpinning PAYGO. So in terms of minister's decisions, so heavy vehicle charges are approved by the Infrastructure and Transport Ministers meeting, and that's a meeting of all the state and territory and the Commonwealth Transport Minister meeting together. And they met on the 9th of December and had a look at basically 3 options we'd consulted on. And in response to that, they agreed in principle to a 3-year road user charging cycle, so lock-in charges for 3 years in a row, but wanted senior officials to consult again on 2 options, being effectively an increase of 6% per annum and an increase of 10% per annum over 3 years, as we showed in the previous graph. So one of the constraints, or one of the factors, is we need that consultation process to meet the requirements set out in the Fuel Tax Act, and that's why we presented that range as 2 distinct options rather than as a range, simply because under the Fuel Tax Act you need concrete proposals to consult on. You can't be vague, it has to be a specific rate. So I'll just quickly go through what the options would look like. So option 1 is the 6% per annum increase, and I've shown there in the table common truck types to show in terms of dollars and percent what the increase would be. Now, the reason why you don't see everything go up by 6%, it's slightly counterintuitive, but I'll explain. The regulatory component of heavy vehicle charges doesn't change by much. So imagine you keep part of that charge constant, but you increase the other part by 6%. Depending on how big that other, or that regulatory component is, it will affect the overall increase as a percentage. And at the same time, the pricing rules require us to reshuffle the prices a little bit and push those categories up, which effectively are currently receiving a cross subsidy. So what we've done is for those that need to go up, we've added 1.5% maximum, and the others pay less. So that's why on average you get 6% increase, but the individual vehicle type might get a little bit more or a little bit less. So anyway, what you can see is, if you look at the smallest truck category of the 2-axle rigid up to 12 tons, you'd see increases of around $25, $26, $27 per year over 3 years, around the 4% mark. However, if you then start to look at the heavy truck and dogs, it becomes a lot more. That's between $800 and roughly and about $940 per year over the 3 years. That would take a registration from 22, 23, the current number of 12,000 roughly, to about 14,600 in the 3rd year. And you can see similar patterns with the 6-axle articulated truck and the 9-axle B-double and the road trains. They all look, in terms of the general pattern, similar. And you can see there for the larger varieties, you get again $800, $900 increases per year. If we then look at the ruck, currently it's 27.2 cents a litre. That would go to 28.8 in 23, 24, 30.5 in 24, 25, and 32.4 cents in 25, 26. Now I'll briefly cover off the 10% option because in some ways, for completeness sake, and what you can see, it's effectively the same pattern as the previous slide, just more of it. So you could potentially see, for example, the worst affected trucks being the 3-axle, the heavy truck and dog over 42.5 tons, could go from currently 12,000 to about 16,250 over 3 years, or a 9-axle B-double from about 15,500 to 20,000. And then if you look at the ruck, that would go from 27.2 to 36.2 over 3 years. Now, I think before I go much further, I should again say that ministers have asked us to consult on that. They have not yet made a decision. So just to give some of the broader financial implications. So if you look at the 6% per annum price path, would raise an additional $1.6 billion over 3 years compared to static revenue at 22, 23 levels. So it's a fairly big increase over 3 years, 10%, additional $2.6 billion, even larger increase. Now, as I said, those increases, though very sizable, would not be enough to close the gap between the cost base and the revenue over the 3 years. So we have published, or we had published, a consultation paper on the NTC website on 21st of December, and submissions closed on the 20th February. Now, we received a number of submissions. They are all visible on our website, including NatRoad. And just to summarise briefly, I think industry's made their views very clear in terms that even the 6% option isn't affordable for industry. The other concerns are that there's doubts about the quality of the investment in the road network. So how much do heavy vehicles actually benefit from the money spent? How well are the projects executed? And also general concern around how transparent is the whole system. So do you know what you're actually getting for your money? We have summarised the submissions and provided a final report to ITIM. We always also include all submissions verbatim and in full, and that's to make sure that ministers can have a look at those themselves or their staff, and there's no filter as to what industry has said. They can read it up precisely. once ITM makes a decision, we will then move towards implementation of whatever the approved price path is. I'd hoped by now we'd have a decision, but we haven't. I expect that'll probably be available in the next month or so. But again, with ministers' decision making, it's pretty unpredictable. So I think one of the important considerations that we're aware of is that one of the reasons industry has generally supported the concept of setting prices for multiple years is that it gives vehicle owners and operators a bit of certainty about what future heavy vehicle charges will be. And it's important, I think, that operators are aware of the future charges and the implications for their business. So what we will do as soon as a decision is made and we can effectively confirm that, is we will be updating our website to reflect that decision and show the precise charges that will apply over the 3 years. So the information will be available. It will also be available over time with your state and territory registration agencies. But I think the thing that, of course, you're aware that you, in some ways, the sooner you can build those final charges into your business planning and pricing decisions, the better. Of course, again, that's a point the industry has made very clearly, is that that's not an easy task, and that there's a great deal of customer reluctance to accept price changes. On the other hand, it affects every operator the same, and there's my understanding is there's not sufficient profit margins in the system for operators to absorb any of this, so it will have to find its way into the final charges that industry operators charge their customers. And we are actively trying to work with industry associations such as NatRoad, the ATA, ALRTA, and all the other associations to do our best to heighten the awareness of this as the one thing, to try and promote or make it easier for businesses to take into account what's going to happen in the future. So that brings me to the end of my slides. I'll stop that presentation now and hand back to Michelle for questions and answers.
Great, thanks, Ramon. We will start with our first question. Many owner-operators face long hours, high levels of stress, and uncertainty around income, as we are often paid on a per load basis. Can you provide some examples of how the 3-year road user charge cycle will provide greater certainty and stability to the industry, particularly in terms of budgeting for operating costs?
Okay, I would say that the uncertainty around when you're going to be working and how probably doesn't change. But at least what you know for the next 3 years is exactly what you'll be paying for registration charges and RUC. So our hope would be that when you look at your business planning, so you're budgeting for the next few years, you'd at least be able to lock that part of things in. So that will at least give you certainty over part of your operating expenditure. Of course, I understand that there's a whole lot of other factors that will still move around, such as the cost of maintenance, spare parts, the pure fuel cost, and also interest rates if you have a business loan. So it won't address the entire uncertainty you face, but at least it's one thing that we can lock in, and that you should have certainty that there will be no further changes to that for the 3-year price cycle.
Great. We have another one. Could you speak to any potential challenges or concerns that may arise from transitioning to a multi-year cost model, and how the NTC plans to address these? Please elaborate with some practical budgeting advice and simple steps to take for commercial cost recovery that road freight operators may consider implementing to meet these challenges.
Okay, so I mean the challenge is, of course, that you're operating in a very fluid environment. But the advice, the only practical advice I can give you, and I'm not an expert on business planning, but I would say that if you, for example, base your pricing decisions based on a very good understanding of what your operating costs are going to be for a year or 2 or 3, that should improve your ability to at least know for each job how much profit you're going to make or not. Now, that doesn't get you around the challenge that you work in a competitive environment, and from time to time you might be outbid. But I would say, at least if you have a good pricing model, it's just one of those inputs that you can put in, and that gives you an idea of what your cost is for a particular piece of work that you're bidding for. So really, that's the only thing I can advise, is that it's one input into a multifaceted planning and pricing process, and at least it's one you can build in and hold constant. But it doesn't get around the problem there, or the challenge that everything else moves around as well. So potentially, if you depending on what your fuel purchase arrangements are, do you get any certainty in there? I mean, I don't know. I think if you're big enough, maybe you do. But it's about those other things. It's a little bit like, if you buy your electricity, sometimes you can get a multi-year contract that locks in your price. It's a little bit like a fixed rate, mortgage, in the sense that at least you know what one part of your whole cost structure is going to be.
Great, thank you. We don't have any other questions, so thank you again, Ramon, for presenting, and thank you everyone for attending. This webinar was recorded and it will be uploaded to the NatRoad website, and a link will be emailed to members as well. If you have any questions though, just email info@natroad.com.au and we can pass it on to Ramon. So thank you and have a great day.
Yeah, thanks everybody for your time and your questions. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.